Good day, everyone. Welcome to This is 42 podcast. My name is Desh. This week, I'm speaking to Jesse Morton. Jesse used to be a jihadist. He's listed as America's first jihadist. This truly was a completely mind-altering conversation. We speak about his entire journey of just being a teenager, then being into psychedelic drugs and becoming a drug dealer and eventually turning into a jihadist. We speak about some of his actions that even today ISIS continue to use. We speak about how he came out of this. We speak about what he is doing right now. This conversation is a must-hear conversation. I'm not just saying it because I'm hosting this podcast. This completely blew my mind. And this is coming from somebody who made a film called Islam and the Future of Tolerance. I truly hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you like it, please subscribe and spread the message. Here's Jesse. Thank you for coming on the podcast, mate.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So, Jesse is a newly adopted name, or was that your birth name?
I was born Jesse Curtis Morton, but became Yunus Abdullah Muhammad after converting. And now I prefer Jesse Morton because I basically killed my self and was full of self-loathing and self-hating. And Islam gave me a different identity.
Right.
But in order to heal, I had to learn how to love the person that I was born as. And so the name change has actually been significant, both as a process of my radicalization and as a process of my de-radicalization as well. Right. So going from Jesse to Yunus and back to Jesse.
Was there a specific reason when you picked the name you did?
So Yunus Abdullah Muhammad has implications because it was used to radicalize me. So I found the teachings of Islam in jail after converting, and I was taught by a Moroccan veteran of the Afghan Soviet Jihad the basics of Islam. He told me when I told him I was Muslim that I wasn't yet Muslim because I didn't know how to pray and I didn't know the 5 pillars and I didn't understand the Quran. And after about 30 days of indoctrination and making me memorize how to pray in Arabic, he told me that I should go into the jailhouse shower and make what they call ghusl. And you have to wash every inch of your body and every square spot of your body, because when you convert to Islam, essentially you're a baby. All of your previous sins are forgiven and you're basically born anew. The convert gets this extra blessing. And so he told me that when I came out of the shower, I would be a new baby and I would be starting a new life, and that he would give me a new name. So for someone who had grown to hate themselves and who had grown to be full of really, trauma to the degree that it was incredibly severe at this moment, it was an opportunity for me to press a reset button. And so Yunus is Jonah in the Bible, or the one who was swallowed by the belly of the whale. And so he said, you're in the belly of the beast, you're in jail now. And Jonah actually was someone who ran away from God's messages for his entire life. And then when he accepted God's message, having been rescued, he preached to the people of Nineveh, and he was one of the only successful messengers because all of his people converted. So go tell your people about Islam and use your powers and your strengths in negativity and apply them to the positive. That's what made Jonah or Yunus powerful. And Abdullah is a slave of Allah. You're really literally nothing. You're just a slave. There's nothing special about you. You're just dust. The only thing that you have of value is that Allah might guide you. And then he said Muhammad is the best name in the world, so I attach Muhammad at the end because this is the man that you're supposed to emulate. And then he described Muhammad as someone who was not turned the other cheek like Jesus, but was one who gave us every single thing, from how to use the bathroom to how to wage jihad.
That is incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I can see how that must have had an impact. Okay, my next question was going to be, what inspired you to turn to Islam? Part of it is almost explained, like when you have such powerful terminology given to somebody. What was how old were you when you converted to Islam?
So I first got interested in Islam at 19 during my very first experience in county jail, when I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X. So I started to explore Islam, and I officially converted at the age of 20, largely because of what I perceived to be a miracle on the streets of Philadelphia.
Right.
tell me a little bit about getting into that county jail situation.
Mm-hmm.
What was your childhood like? Why did you end up there?
So I grew up in a strange situation in rural Pennsylvania. My father I'm actually a descendant on my father's side of Samuel Adams and sons and daughters of the American Revolution, a very privileged Boston elite family that ended up in New York City, or actually Cranford, New Jersey. My father's dad was set to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state of New Jersey ever, but he died out of nowhere from lung cancer. He used to smoke like 3 packs a day when my father was a senior in high school. And it altered the trajectory of my father away from privileged Jersey kid to countercultural beatnik. So he decided that he wanted to move to rural Pennsylvania and go to a liberal arts college and learn Pennsylvania woodwork construction and sort of drop off the grid. And he did by finding my mother, who was a very poor working class woman, at a pantry in rural Pennsylvania. And they had me. And in those days, when you knocked a woman up, you had to marry them. It was much more norm. And it was really the impregnation of my mother that forced the marriage. That was a very, very, very bad marriage for both people. My father started to commit adultery, and probably always had been committing adultery on my mother, and it essentially over time drove her insane. And as she was a mother in the household, she started to take out her rage and frustration on her children. I was the oldest of 3, and abusers typically choose one child not to abuse. So my mother started to do things that progressively got worse and worse. And we're not talking just spankings. We're talking biting on inner thighs. We're talking pulling chunks of hair out of heads. We're talking choking to the point where you can see finger marks. And I'm showing my father this, and I'm showing my grandmother this, and no one's intervening. And then my mother starts, as my sister gets older, to beat my sister too. So I adopt this concept of self-sacrifice, that life's meaning is suffering, and that I'm willing to suffer for the sake of protecting someone else, and that's my sister. And it's very much the sense of injustice and the willing to sacrifice that ran congruent with what I adopted when I became a jihadist. It was like, I want to kill myself for something bigger. And so I developed this mentality, and when society didn't intervene, I ran away 3 months after I told a guidance counselor that my mother had pinched my cheeks shut so far tight together that I had been experiencing pain for 2 weeks as a result of she used to pull my gums out. And I told the guidance counselor, and he never intervened. And then I knew that my society wouldn't protect me. So I was drifting around, sort of traveling with the hippies after running away to the streets out. I started out back at Port Authority in New York City and Manhattan. Learned how to peddle, marijuana to tourists, met some hippies, and ended up traveling and escaping. But the life of counterculturalism on the left wasn't healthy for me, because I started to use hallucinogenics. I started to, I always smoked weed every day for quite a few years, but started to progress into narcotics. And I found myself getting arrested in State College at a Grateful Dead show, and going to the local county jail. And in the morning they woke me up and they said, "You want to go get a book? It's library day." And I was like, sure. So I go to the basement of the jailhouse library, in a really impoverished county. So it's all like Western novels and romance novels, and it's just complete trash. But the one thing I found that was of interest was the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And I just had this sort of moment of catharsis as I started to read it. And I was intrigued, and then I got to the chapter where Malcolm goes to Mecca and prays with white people and totally changes his non-Orthodox version of Islam and adopts Sunni Islam. And I was like, this is exactly the life I want to live. I want to be an activist. But it still was largely just a projection of that same archetype or that same personality that had developed around the abuse and the trauma at home.
Wow. How do you go from learning about Islam through the lens of Malcolm X in an American jail to, you already mentioned that you're a former jihadi.
Mm-hmm.
The term jihadi is, it's a very strong term. It has certain connotations.
Yes.
How do you go from following Malcolm X to a jihadi? What happened there?
I mean, so Malcolm, we don't know how Malcolm would have felt about Osama bin Laden and the war on terror. But for us, it was a clear case where Malcolm would have supported it because of the by any means necessary speech, right? What we don't understand is that a lot of the rhetoric that was completely polarizing and hateful of Malcolm was mitigated and altered when he went to Mecca. And so Malcolm came back very differently. So I like to say now that I understood the religion of Islam through the lens of Malcolm X before he found the religion of Muhammad. And so that what I practiced was much closer to a version of Farrakhanism or Elijah Muhammadism, and its fighting hate with hate, as opposed to the Prophet Muhammad, who attacked the ills and afflictions of his society at a higher order of consciousness. And I think that that's what Malcolm learned when he went to Mecca today. So it's really hard to frame people without understanding the nuances of their age. And again, a traumatized brain loves to view the world in very simplistic narratives. So not able to recognize the nuanced differences between Malcolm pre-trip to Mecca and post-trip to Mecca, and not able to understand that you can't study a religion that's 1,400 years old through the lens of a activist that didn't even speak the language it was revealed in. That you have to go back to the sources, and you have to be scholarly if you're going to profess scholarly opinions and promote the idea that Islam justifies the killing of civilians. So it really was, again, an adoption of a external ideology that suit my preconceived projection of rage and frustration, probably with self, but also with the society around me.
Right. I urge everyone who's listening to this to definitely check out the Cafe Classroom lecture with Jesse. That'll give you a bit more context into this story. Getting back to your life as a jihadist, when you were preaching certain ideologies, did you ever put it in a context of sort of your family and the friends you had, or was it quite binary, us versus them?
I don't know if I understand the question completely, but...
So, you came from a dysfunctional family,
yes,
but a family nonetheless,
yes,
right? And it's in the West. So when jihadi ideologies generally have this sort of view, it's us versus them,
right,
and Islam is under attack,
yes,
and us Muslims have to challenge this narrative. But when you were out there talking about these matters, your family that you left and your friends, the hippies, none of them were Muslim.
Right. So I grew to hate them.
Okay.
Right. So I grew to reject everything that they stood for, and never really had much contact with my family for many years. From the time that I ran away at 16, I had to reestablish that. But they represented the embodiment of everything that I had come to hate. So my identity literally merged with the Muslims. My wife was Moroccan. My children are raised with Arabic culture, not American culture, so to say. Everything that was culturally quote-unquote American was frowned upon. Right. And Muslims that imitated westernized interpretations of religion and were also frowned upon and looked as either hypocrites or apostates altogether.
So 2011, you threatened South Park creators.
2010.
2010.
Yes.
What's the story behind this South Park incident?
Okay. So we ran a very popular website, and of course it's not about how many people are dead in terrorism, it's about how many people are watching. One of the main mechanisms for recruitment was to get the mainstream media to cover the controversial things that we would do. And we had grown more and increasingly willing to test the bounds of free speech. And I had a young adherent who I recruited to be a propagandist, a very wealthy, elite kid, grew up in private schools, richest county in the United States, white kid, converts to Islam, and within 30 days is talking directly with Anwar al-Awlaki and becoming radical. The fastest case of radicalization we had seen up to that point. This is where trends in jihadism are transitioning. And so this guy is given access to my website as an administrator because he's putting in massive hours. He is go hard or go home type mentality, completely starts to just live this 24 hours a day. And he's helpful because he gives me an increased number of outputs on my website, and he's really good at attracting attention. So South Park is about to go into its 200th episode. So there's a big fanfare around that. And on Entertainment Tonight, or one of those extra type shows, they asked what's in store for the 200th episode. And they say, well, we're going to do some things that are considered sacrilegious. And they hint that they're going to portray the Prophet Muhammad. So to preempt that, we posted on the website a picture of Theo Van Gogh, who was killed for making a film that was deemed anti-Islamic and was killed by a jihadist on a street of Amsterdam with a knife in his back while he was riding a bike. And so we posted a picture of him dead on an Amsterdam street and said that Trey Stone and Matt Parker, or is it Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, would likely end up like Theo Van Gogh. But that wasn't enough to break the law. What broke the law was the fact that we posted likely addresses to where they could be found and where they could be housed. And so ultimately that was the communication of a threat that surpassed for the first time the First Amendment protection of free expression. And 4 months after that, after a large amount of controversy that made our website completely notorious, and we ran for the top 10 websites in the world for about a month and stayed in the top 10,000 websites in the world after that until we were disbanded. My co-conspirator tried to travel to join Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda's outfit in Somalia, and I knew the time was up. So I got on a plane with my family, my newborn son and my pregnant wife, and we moved to her country of Morocco to try to figure out how the hell we could run from what was clear to us about to become an indictment for my arrest.
Right. And from that moment in Morocco, you did end up going to jail in Morocco.
I stayed in Morocco for about 9 months before they issued the indictment.
Right.
And when I went to Morocco, the Arab Spring broke out.
Right.
So here I am. I have to survive by doing private tutoring with the millennial Arab youth, who I loathe because they're westernized. But in the context of the Arab Spring, there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of energy. It's a very curious and conscious time to be alive in a space. And really, long story short, I start to recognize the totalitarian nature of the Islamist agenda. And I start to contemplate this idea of top-down change versus bottom-up change. And I start to actually become enthralled with the Arab millennial modernist culture. I like the idea that they love Islam, but they don't take it that seriously. But that they really want just an opportunity to think and express themselves and to have elected governments that are not corrupt. And when you live around in Morocco and you have this conspiracy theory where the United States is creating the oppression of the Middle East by arming these authoritarian regimes, you realize how little impact America actually has there, and that this is actually an indigenous result of corruption and flaws inside of that those societies. There's much more independence than I think I recognized, and I really started to have doubts. Although de-radicalization, just like radicalization, is a process, not an event.
But what is it, the American indictment that led you to jail over there?
So after about 8 months and them trying to lure me to come into the embassy so that they could arrest me and me not doing so, they just issued online an indictment. So one of the anti-Islamic bloggers found the indictment online, and I opened my email box in the morning and he's like, "Congratulations on the indictment, dickhead." And so I Googled my name and I was like, okay, so you're wanted by the United States. And this was about 10 days after Osama bin Laden was killed. So I was like, okay, well, this must be them making a move on trying to eradicate this thing completely. And in fact, it was. And in fact, for the next several months, and maybe even up to a year, we figured the war on terror would wind down. It took them a couple weeks. I thought about going to Libya, where they were waging jihad against Gaddafi. But I made a prayer called Salatul Istikhara, which is when you have to make a decision, and then you look for a sign from God. And when I finished the prayer, in accordance with the manner that it was performed by the Prophet, I turned around and both of my newborn sons were standing up in a crib looking at me pray. So I figured I was supposed to face the music. And it came out of a Salafi Jihadi mosque in Casablanca in the slums, and streets were empty, and one policeman was on the street. And I walked about a block and put my hands behind my back and went to Moroccan jail until they extradited me to the United States 5 months later, and watched as Syria became the death knell of the Arab Spring, and things started to get even more confusing.
And with time, so how long did you end up staying in prison?
So I spent 5 months in Morocco, and then I was flown home on a private American jet by FBI, Secret Service, and every other ABC agency. They put me in solitary confinement in Alexandria, Virginia for almost a year, and it's then that they met me after I took a plea, where I had to do a debriefing process with the FBI. And by that time, as a result of a guard taking me to the law library for 10-hour shifts 4 days a week, and me getting into things like the Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world and the Western post-Enlightenment philosophers and Thomas Paine and all of these things, going back into my cell and reading Islam through a different lens, the FBI made a very different person. And the first thing that happened was someone offered me information about a terrorist attack that was in prison with me, and I was faced with the question of whether to tell or not, and I informed them. So originally they sentenced me to 11 and a half years in prison, but my students started to appear in Syria. ISIS broke out. The war on terror clearly was not over. So from May 23rd, 2011 until March 1st, 2015, I was incarcerated, but I should still technically be incarcerated today if my original sentence was upheld. They called me back in front of a judge, and due to the nature and the degree of my cooperation, the judge let me go.
How difficult was it for you to distance yourself from something that really gave you the personhood that you embodied that? How difficult was it to distance yourself from that?
So you have to transform your identity into something completely new in order to kill yourself that you hate. And then you have to learn that in order to remove that identity, which you clearly is not you, you have to learn how to love the person that you hated. And so I'm still on that track, right? So really reconfiguring exactly who is Jesse Morton and what degree Yunus Abdullah Muhammad still exists in him, even if you think Yunus Abdullah Muhammad is gone, is something that is going to go on for the rest of my existence. It's been a process. When I get out of prison, I was able to convince the jihadists that I had won on an appeal, and my old scholars welcomed me right back into the milieu, and I was able to operate as an informant. So I was literally trying to de-radicalize while operating as a Salafi jihadist on a day-to-day basis in conjunction with the FBI.
So how do
this
you...
was awkward. Yeah.
Awkward is one way to put it. So that was actually going to be my next question, because I can imagine all those organizational ties you had, they would be still interested in working with you. So how do you navigate sort of disconnecting from those ties? Or do you still keep certain ties just to help the radicalization process?
So now that I work to combat, I never wanted to go public. I ended up becoming America's first former jihadist. But I was outed by the Washington Post as an informant after being accused of entrapping two Muslims that were about to behead in America. There's a big problem here in the United States where every case the FBI intervenes is deemed to be entrapment and conspiracy, and it's not the case. But they tried to paint me that way in court, and the defense attorneys gave my name and said, "Your Honor, the U.S. government is working with a former jihadist in this case, so they're paying a former jihadist to set my client up, and this is wrong." And he told him to shut up or he'd be sitting where his client was. But it didn't matter because a Washington Post reporter in the back of the room ran with the story. So I was faced with this complex issue where now the American Muslim community thought I was an informant, and I was an informant, but I was actually doing good. And they painted me as someone who created a plot that I did not create, and I was under risk. The FBI had to move me from my home, and I was asked if I wanted to be in protection, and I said no. And rather than go into protection and go into hiding and be in fear, I just said, you know what, I'm going to start to take steps, and I'm just going to completely come out and talk about my life. And so about 6 months after that, I went public at the program on extremism at George Washington University, and I was hired as a research fellow. Because while I was radicalizing, I graduated from Columbia University with a master's degree in international affairs, so I do have a research background as well.
Right.
So I went public 6 months after I was outed by the Washington Post. So it's this weird dynamic where now I interact with the counterterrorism community, I interact with the what I call the intelligentsia, like the people that are affiliated with countering violent extremism and counterterrorism. They could be from non-governmental organizations that operate in Pakistan all the way to like people that are doing local stuff. I also interact with jihadists because I conduct one-on-one interventions with people that believe exactly like I used to believe, and I still now have a good relationship with the American Muslim community. I'm still mosqued Muslim, practicing Muslim, and so yeah, I mean, now I'm able through all of those engagements with all those overlapping but at the same time unique and independent networks, able to understand the importance of complexity and creativity, because it takes a certain level of creativity to flip-flop back and forth between the two.
Does that worry you that somebody potentially as eloquent as you might drag you back into some unwanted ideologies?
No, I think I've deconstructed it to a degree where I realized that the ideological affinity that I held was largely a projection of my internal hate and personal turmoil. I think that the ideologies that we adopt when we're traumatized can be like drugs, because after I de-radicalized and changed my affinity for the ideology, I actually didn't realize it, but I was left right back off to that scared, traumatized kid who was numbing his pain with drugs and alcohol in order to survive. The ideology simply became the drugs and the alcohol, because the drugs and the alcohol was starting to tear me apart as a youth.
Right.
And so I actually relapsed for the first time in 17 years, which was actually a part of my de-radicalization process and is now a part of my recovery, is the fact that I relapsed on cocaine after 17 years of sobriety, because I thought I was changed, so I figured that I could go back to hanging out, and forgot that I was an addict. And now I see ideology and extremism largely as an addiction.
Right.
And treat it as such too.
And you know, earlier you spoke about how certain, before you became radicalized, certain view of the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Now you mention Enlightenment principles,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
So how easy / hard was it for you to come back to the Western way of society?
I mean, I think anybody who objectively steps away from themselves and starts to look at their own bias and reflects upon the objective principles that the Enlightenment represents can get around emotional allegiances that are unjustified. And one of the things that looking at Enlightenment philosophy does for you is it allows you to recognize the tribalist nature of history, and the way that the Enlightenment philosophers were able to overcome sectarian strife largely based upon religion, and to consider all of what is considered sacred as questionable, and then from there to develop this idea of individual liberty and freedom. And I think in every objective sense, the development that has occurred since then and the exponential advancement and evolution of whether it's technology or whether it's creativity or whether it's art or whatever level you measure it, and it's clear and it's evident. I just fear that in some ways we're trekking backward into totalitarianism and authoritarianism again, and that I think that the degree to which we do so will correlate to progress and to continuous development. So it's not hard. You just have to get away from yourself and step outside and look at what's very clear and evident.
So, from a religious perspective, you mentioned you're a practicing Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider yourself a reformist Muslim, or do you have a, because there are multiple movements.
Sure.
There's progressive Muslims
Sure.
out there doing range of things.
One of the great things about believing in individual liberty is that you can have your own interpretation of Islam, and that can be your Islam.
I see.
And I don't push it on anyone else, but I love to talk about the religion, and I find myself in conversations with Salafi jihadis, Salafists, modernists, and I have different, completely my own nuanced views.
Right.
And I absolutely continue to study the dogma, continue to study the history, continue to study the jurisprudence, and I'm fascinated by it because it is still something that I consider to be divine to a degree,
Okay.
but also flawed. And I think seeing the flaws in your ideology allows you to be okay with the flaws inside of yourself.
I see. How do you view there is a growing movement of ex-Muslim
Yes.
activists?
Mhm.
Are they helping the cause or making it harder?
I think it depends on what the cause is. So their cause is, oftentimes, in my opinion, although I can't see intentions, money and fame.
Right.
And the problem is that those that do it, who have a nuanced understanding of their religion, are basically zero. So none of these people that are ex-Muslims tends to really have a scholarly background in any field of science, and I just believe that that's dangerous.
When you say a scholarly understanding of science, what do you mean by that?
So I really do think that in Islam it's a very unique religion in the sense that there are sciences attached to it that are not necessarily attached to other religions.
Okay.
So with regard to Quran, we only have one Quran in Islam.
Sure.
Right? And they're a Shiite, a Sunni, they read the same Quran letter for letter. No difference. Number of verses, everything is the same. And it's considered the word of God. Very different mentality. To hold something as the word of God versus the inspired word of God is a fundamental distinction and requires a lot of justification and defense. And so what we have that is the most the closest thing to other religions in Islam is the science of hadith, or a hadith, which are the narrations attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. It is oftentimes the hadith that are the most problematic, right? So for the fundamentalists, the hadith are considered akin at the same level of the Quran. There's no real distinction between the two. And for the ex-Muslim, the isolated hadith that they quote to point to the fact that the Quran must not be true are, even by those fundamentalist Muslims, oftentimes held to be what we call da'if, or weak. So without understanding the science of hadith, then one should not really comment on the textual validity or comment on the text of the religion, right? It's very problematic, and it's difficult to do so in a Muslim world that considers the epistemological basis of a large portion of what they do and believe in to be theological as opposed to rational.
Right. So within the religion, and you mentioned that how unique Islam as a religion is, because it is not just a religion, because it embedded in the religious text is governance. You know,
it's a complete way of life. Yes.
So in the Western way of society, we have governance from a secular point of view, where religion sits outside of that.
Yes.
From a Islamic point of view, that cannot exist as such from a pure interpretation of the Quran.
From an Islamist perspective, but not from a general layman Muslim perspective, or from even someone who's scholarly. So, for example, if you know the hadith and you know how to point to it, there's a statement where the Prophet, may peace and blessings be upon him, is walking through Medina, which is a town north of Arabia, of Mecca, which is known for its date production. And he points to a date tree and he says, why are you separating the sexes? Right? Don't do this. Right? And so they think that, okay, he's prophet, so they follow it, and the next year the yield goes down, right, as a consequence of obeying the Prophet and his recommendation. And they say, look, Ya Rasulullah, we followed your order and we're not getting as many dates as we got last year. And he says, I am a messenger that's brought to you to teach you religion. I am not one who knows about the worldly affairs, so don't follow me in the worldly matters. This alone is secularism. And this is a hadith that all of the scholars in Islam attribute to the Prophet. So what the jihadists do is they take a word called hakimiyya, and hukm, they say, refers to legislation. But the law's hukm, his legislation, has to do predominantly, if you read fiqh, jurisprudence in Islam, how to wash for prayer, how to pray 5 times a day, when to wake up in the middle of the night to pray, how to treat your wife, how to clean your teeth. And then there's a little piece on governance and how to punish people that commit crimes. And the reality is the overwhelming majority of those narrations are questionable. So it's almost as if they were inserted as this society grew after the time of the Prophet Muhammad and needed governance. And at that time, by consensus of the fact that the hadith were not written down for several hundred years, we have people saying the Prophet said such and such, the Prophet said such and such, for political reasons. And so there needed to be some way to implement certain things. And so you just simply say the Prophet said such and such, I'm the Khalifa, and the Prophet said such and such, and this scholar says it, and this exists. And so I'm not so sure that there was ever any prophet that even governed. I think the Prophet created a society that was bottom up, where governance arose as a need, but where really what the Prophet did was he created a groundswell of support. I look at Islam as a literacy movement. I look at Islam as a paradigm shift in human consciousness.
It seems as you have a certain view of Islam, as you earlier pointed out, is an interpretation that you have come to, a scholarly interpretation that you have come to, but majority of the people that follow the practice may not see it that way.
Absolutely, the majority certainly would not. They consider Islam a complete way of life. Yes.
How do you overcome that? Because there's Pew Research data in developed countries where majority following the faith have some problematic views with regards to homosexuality and certain matters that in the West we consider there shouldn't be a negative view. So how do you combat that?
So my objective in my life's work, I don't think yet has gotten to the point where I look at the macro.
Right.
So my concern is not necessarily the radical cognizance of the collective, but the risk that those that are cognitively radicalized might take the tipping point toward violent extremism.
Right.
And so, but I will say that at a level of prevention, those that are having those conversations and addressing those concerns are doing the work that we need to do for the long term.
Okay.
I'm more worried about preservation of safety for the short term, but I'd love to get more involved in that space, but you have to choose your battles and you have to choose your specialties. If I start to press back against these, which I agree with, I totally agree that these are irrational positions and that they're also not necessarily because these people know anything about Islam. I believe that the majority of people that hold these popular opinions don't know much about Islam. In fact, I know that they don't know that much about Islam, but they assume something that is largely cultural and has been passed down. And the only way to really eradicate that is to continue to promote things like liberal education and critical thinking at a macro level.
Which is a good point to now talk about. You have a counter-jihadist magazine.
Mm-hmm. One from our activities. I run an organization called Parallel Networks. We do an array of different international and domestic initiatives. But we have a domestic countering violent extremism ecosystemic approach. And in the same way that we use the jihadist magazines to radicalize and recruit, we now created a counter English language jihadi magazine that outdoes their graphic design quality, restructures and deconstructs the ideology, and then poses an alternative macro view or perspective that we call our Dialogue of Civilizations model. We use it as a tool for one-on-one intervention, as a curriculum guide for conducting community level and individual level discussions. And we are doing the very first public counter-narrative campaign in Telegram, where jihadists are flourishing now as a result of being kicked off of Twitter and Facebook. And we use it to combat and to argue with the hubs of their network to show that we can refute them, and to screenshot that so that that gets disseminated wherever those radicalizers and recruiters operate, and also to present pathways to people so that they can engage with me and other former extremists that work with the organization to get an intervention that can take them out of support for the movement.
So you mentioned how you are challenging the narrative in a place like Telegram.
Mm-hmm.
There are existing jihadist magazines.
Yes.
Dabik and Rumea,
Mm-hmm.
they're like really high-end magazines. How do you challenge them, and how do you get to that readership?
Well, first of all, they can't have them because I created them, so I'm the only person that can take back the template.
Right.
And then secondarily, I'm very good at networking and recruiting, so I have constantly, as I speak and as I engage in what I do, I constantly recruit talent. In the same way that I put together the network that built them, I put together an antithetical network now full of graphic designers that are, more creative. I mean, if you look at one of their magazines, one thing you noticed when you look at the state of the traumatized and the radical brain is an inability to understand complexity, and it comes out in the art form. So it's very blocked. It's very square. What we do is we play with the imagery in a way that is very superior. And then, truth be told, having been an expert in the Salafi Jihadi doctrine and ideology, and having dissected it and deconstructed it, it's very easy for me to do so with the words that I write in the content of the magazine. And I have yet to meet a Salafi Jihadi that has been able to put forth any competent refutation of it. Every time they try to address even one of the articles in it, we tear them apart, to the point where they have started to say on Telegram that they're not even allowed to interact with me because they know they have no response to me, and that's good. That's an indicator that their silence is essentially an inability to counter our narrative. So it's good.
Activists and intellectuals in the West, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, they say the term Islamophobia is preventing from people having nuanced conversation. Where do you stand with regards to? I don't think anyone can really say anti-Muslim bigotry is non-existing. That's an actual problem.
That's a different term.
Terminology like Islamophobia, is it preventing from conversation from happening?
Absolutely. One thing that we do know about reported hate crimes is that typically the majority of them are fabricated. And so one of the problems with Islamophobia is if it can get you attention, and it happens all the time. And of course, it's not popular to say this, but what you can do is you can portray a term that can become adopted by a community that perceives itself to be under attack. And again, this is a component of radicalization. You perceive yourself to be under attack because you are a Muslim or because you are Islam, and they are fearful of you. But in fact, I think that there is every reason to be fearful because of what we talk about with the natural predisposition of the human being to be tribalist in their interpretations, and you have real Muslims committing acts of terrorism. And I don't think that there is anything wrong with people being fearful of that phenomenon. And if you conflate fear of jihadists with fear of general Muslims, then what you're suggesting is that you're basically adopting the same narrative that the jihadists adopt, that you're not allowed to practice your religion, and that they hate the true religion of Islam. And it's very popular to be espoused in the masked Muslim community. We should also ask unmasked Muslims what they feel about the term Islamophobia, because all unmasked Muslims that I talk to think it's a racket, and that it promotes a victimization discourse that only facilitates a grievance that's unreal and unacknowledged. And it's a shame, because it simply is true. If objectively you measure the status of American Muslims, for example, there's really no recognition of this, but American Muslims outperform the rest of America at educational attainment, at levels of assimilation, at levels of income, at almost every level of success they outperform. Well, there's got to be a reason for that, and it's called freedom, democracy, and capitalism. And there's really limited ability to acknowledge that when you are portraying yourself as a victim. And this is not the majority view, but unfortunately, the way the mosque communities run, whether it's here, Britain, Australia, or Canada, is a very small group of popular, prominent, activist-oriented imams control that narrative, and it serves their own agenda.
Right.
So I don't agree with the use of the term.
Right. The other people that use that term are well-meaning liberals who are worried for a minority.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Where do they place in this narrative? Because they want to help.
Yeah. Well, they think they want to help, but they will make the problem worse, and that's typically the case with far leftist reverse totalitarianism in general. They make good bedfellows. So in the American ambit, American Muslim mosque community in particular used to vote predominantly conservative up until the Iraq War. And then it was really the transition into the Obama era where the American mosque Muslim community developed a more activist, sort of far leftist allegiance with the progressive factions of the Democratic Party. And the allegations were definitely that basically the American Muslim vote is valuable, right? And also what it allows you to do is it allows you to portray the other, which in this case is the right wing and the conservatives, as waging this war against Islam. And so it's really beneficial to espouse bigotry. The problem is that it's unnuanced and it creates more polarization, and we're witnessing that with the accounts of people like Ilhan Omar, their manifestations as young people of this 15-year period post World War Terror, post invasion of Iraq, where this allegiance unfolded, and the narrative is not Muslim or Islamic at all. It's actually far leftism synthesized with a masked sort of interpretation, and it's really strange because they contradict each other in so many ways. The masked American Muslim community certainly doesn't advocate homosexuality, for example, but for far leftists, their first critique of the right is that they are they are homophobic. In so many ways, there's cases like that are just absolutely outlandish, but it's convenient political bedfellows.
Right. So you mentioned far-right extremism, which is, there is a growing worry globally in the West that this might end up becoming far worse than what it is right now. In America, there are pockets of this, and there's been a number of violent incidents, including the Christchurch incident. You made a few comments during our cafe classroom explaining that you can see the parallels very clearly. Can you explain that a little bit more?
So, speaking and staying in the same vein of one manifestation of this problem and the way that we're addressing it is the allegiance between the American Muslim community claiming Islamophobia and its allegiance with the far leftist community claiming Islamophobia. Because when we wanted to attack the problem that was jihadism, the far leftist community allied with the American Muslim community in preventing every step towards developing programs and initiatives that could counter violent extremism. Now, they want to do the very same things that they opposed with the far right because it's the other. So now we want to discuss Donald Trump as a white supremacist, and in fact, he Make America Great Again may have tints of white nationalism in it, but what happens is there's a conflation in the general population that conflates everyone with a MAGA hat as your next neo-Nazi, mass shooter. And that creates the hysteria which galvanizes a further polarization of the domestic landscape. And that paranoia actually arms and serves as a recruitment fodder for the right-wing extremists, in the same way that we would go out and we would wave a black flag and we would get on TV by saying heinous things. CNN would come and they would follow us, and it was a very controversial story. And it would portray ourselves as brave actors willing to stand up to perceived grievances. So we were only a very fringe of a fringe. But when you talk about doing that on a grand scale with a group like the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer or something like this, you're not talking about groups that represent people in the hundreds. You're talking about groups that represent people in the tens of thousands. And those sympathies are going to ring true and resonant. And so when they're calling for the takedown of material now, they were really quick to point out the counter consequence or the counterintuitive consequences of restricting speech. In my era, they were very quick to point that out. But now they want to do it with regard to people like Sam Harris, for example, who, as controversial as he might be, certainly does not call for shooting up schools. But what happens when you ostracize him and you kick him off or you deplatform him is the conspiracy theory narrative is confirmed. So in so many different ways, we're replicating the same mistakes. The problem is the degree of threat is so much higher amongst far right-wing extremists in the West. And the real problem is that in order for democracy and liberalism to sustain itself, it can't function in a polarized environment, because policy change will be too drastic and too different between the differing opinions and the increasingly radicalizing nature of the far left and the far right, and them becoming mainstreamed as a result of these conversations that are going on between each polarized milieu. Is the porous borders between radicalism and the far right are starting to blur. So Breitbart has taken over for Fox, and MSNBC has taken over for CNN. And as that gets further and further apart, there's no way you can have a functioning democracy, because the minute one party takes over for the other, the tearing down of the policies that took place over the previous 4 years takes 2 years into the next administration. Democracy can't work like that. There's no way that it can sustain itself, and so ultimately it would malfunction.
Right. In a way, some of the ultimate expectations of jihadists are coming true
Yes.
within.
Yeah. Well, the objective is, again, a war of attrition.
Right.
And if you look at doctrine like the Management of Savagery, which is a very serious strategic document of ISIS, they talk directly about polarizing societies everywhere. That in chaos and polarization, where two sides battle against each other, what happens is they malfunction. And then the Islamic State can come in and fill the void in that chaos. And in the West, we used to promote it. Like, we consciously knew that by arming the anti-Islamic bloggers and activists like Pamela Geller, who was later targeted by an ISIS supporter for having everybody draw Muhammad Day in Carswell, Texas, that we were creating the anti-Islamic sentiment that would allow us to paint a picture that these activists were representative of the war of the West against Islam. So that's what happens with Christchurch. Christchurch killer comes the next day. Abu Hassan al-Muhajir releases a statement from ISIS that says Muslims everywhere need to take revenge. And 30 days after that, Sri Lanka happens, and they attack churches and kill random churchgoers in a retaliatory way. So the reciprocal nature between the two is totally beneficial. But when we talk about far right-wing extremist sentiment in the West right now, and those willing to take up arms and commit acts of terrorism, we're talking about very, 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 very small fringe minorities. When we talk about Muslims in the world today, as opposed to on September the 11th, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people that not just empathize with Salafi jihadists, but that are fully committed to their vision and willing to fight and to die, not all willing to blow themselves up into marketplaces, but certainly willing to take up arms in a manner that would defend the very ideological principles of ISIS. So we're dealing with a fundamentally difficult situation where if far right-wing extremism renders democracy inoperable, or our reaction to far right-wing extremism renders our democracies inoperable, and polarization continues to exacerbate, and the multilateral institutions and the liberal world order that we've built up starts to fragment, what you have in the background is the increasing threat of authoritarian regimes, that in China, that in Iran, and that in Russia. And the jihadists will simply assume that that would lead to a World War III type scenario, where in the aftermath of that massive global polarization, which would be a reflection of domestic polarization itself, they would just come and they would resurrect their khilafah in the aftermath in the ashes. And it actually happened during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So they point towards the history of the Prophet Muhammad when the Persians and the Romans were waging war against each other while Arabia was nothing but a backwater. And here comes the Prophet Muhammad, and he's teaching for 23 years the religion of Islam and cultivating the Islamic State while the Persians and the Romans are fighting each other. And then within 100, because their war of attrition against each other renders their own civilizations sort of malfunctioning. In the aftermath of the Prophet Muhammad's death, within 80 years, you have the spread of Islam from into China and all the way into to Spain and to Western Europe. So the jihadists actually believe that the next stage of their Armageddon or apocalyptic trek is, as the Prophet described, you will ally with Al-Rum, the people of Rome, the West, to fight a common enemy from behind you. Right, and then will come what they call Malhama, which is, to translate it, means a battle of lahm, which means a battle of flesh, massive battle of flesh, and from that will come the final call. Now you can read their doctrine. They believe that they will ascend to global superiority within the next. It used to say 12 years. Now they have actually shortened that. They believe within the next 5 to 10 years they'll be in control and ascendant in the global arena.
So that sounds chilling. If you look at the West right now, the conversation you mentioned about deplatforming, a fair number of right-wing commentators, some are provocateurs, some have said awful things. They have been deplatformed from all the large platforms. And you have places like your 4chan, 8chan, Telegram, and all these places now, The Gap, all these places have given them a place to thrive. So lots of people in the West are now just primarily focused on that. What you're saying is, while that is happening, there is this much larger problem that hasn't been dealt with.
So the appetite for the war on terror is waning. And now at a geopolitical level, our foreign policy is focused on power-state competition again. Why? Because the liberal world order, what we don't want to tell our people is, if we look at economic data, the next cyclical downturn, which appears to be on the horizon, We don't have monetary or fiscal policy that can correct it. At the same time, we have a polarizing cultural milieu and status at home that certainly can't be rectified with any foreseeable solution. We have no politician or we have no top-down approach that will rectify that. We have a cultural issue of polarization that no one really knows how to address and deal with. So at the same time, we have domestic problems. I mean, Brexit is largely a reflection of this question about what the liberal world order means and whether or not we want to sustain the one that we built post-World War II. We have the Chinese and Russia and Iran thinking about building high-speed maglev trains through Syria, which they've stuck us in the same way we stuck the Russians in a war of attrition. Back in the 80s in Afghanistan, they've stuck us in Iraq in the same manner, and they are sort of waiting for things to collapse, but they don't want them to collapse overnight. Slowly but surely, China is coming out of its confines, and that's a world order that I don't want to live in, and that I don't think many people want to live in, but I think people take it for granted. I mean, especially like millennials and Gen Zers. I mean, they were born in very coddled historical circumstances where they couldn't fathom a world that's not full of continued technological and economic progress. But we are in fact facing dire straits when we look at the confluence of factors: fiscal, financial, economic, cultural, political. We are in a crisis. And the jihadists are still flourishing and thriving because now we're worried more about China, Iran, and Russia than we are about them. So they're just taking a vacation and slipping off into the clandestine shadows, and they'll be back when the time is appropriate. They'd love to see a war with Iran, and that would be completely fitting for the way that they outline their strategy.
So that's an incredibly dark picture of the world state that you've painted, but I don't think it's based on some paranoia. It seemed to be like when you paint it like that, it starts to make some sense. So how should America and overall the West handle what's happening in Iran or Syria, basically the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to realize that you can't change a society from top down. So that was the blunder that we made in Iraq. But you can plant the seeds and the intellectual infrastructure that can preserve the liberal world order. So when you defend freedom, democracy, and liberal values, when you realize that you can't deplatform without having a counter-effectual outcome, because liberalism is based upon the principle of being able to say things that, as long as they don't advocate for the violence of another, are protected. So you can't betray the very standards that you claim to uphold. And every single level that you look at an intervention that is a top-down intervention, it fails. So we have to preserve this. And there are people all over the world that understand this. What we have to do is we have to get power into their hands. And what I mean by power into their hands is, if we're going to spend $1 trillion a year on military operations is directly related to terrorism, and we spend 0.01% of that on alternatives to military power, we really need to look at why are there more Salafi jihadists today than there were at 9/11, right? So we need to project ideas. We live in a very ideological state where we're all interconnected. All of humanity can hear what each other is saying, and there are people that are sort of galvanized and motivated by extremism, but we don't motivate those that are galvanized and motivated by freedom and liberalism in the same way.
How do you the specific type of Islam you just mentioned is promoted and galvanized by one particular country?
That's true, to a good degree.
And they spend closer to $400 billion buying Australian.
Yes.
Not just Australian, actually. Weaponry from America, right? $400 billion over less than a decade. So, when as you mentioned, there's economic downturns and all those sort of things happening. When you have one country that's able to pretty much spend that kind of money, it's a bit hard to really challenge them afterwards. Because I agree from an ideological point of view, but from a politician's point of view, we have the country has this massive budget deflect. Okay, here's some money coming in, so let's take that money. That's the short-term approach.
They'll buy your weapons even if you attach contingencies upon it. So the overthrow of the Mohamed Morsi regime in Egypt is a perfect example. By our congressional law, we should not have been able to sustain military aid to Sisi because it was certainly the overthrow of a democratically elected government. We could have negotiated ways around that, and the Obama administration turned a complete blind eye. Interestingly enough, the Trump administration actually stopped doing business and sending military aid to Egypt on the condition that it released some of its journalists. So we can actually use the dependency, especially now. Saudi Arabia needs us more than they ever needed us before. Saudi Arabia can't fight Iran. Saudi Arabia can't handle Iran, and Iran is getting increasingly aggressive, whether we believe it or not. The left is allied with Iran's narrative, but they clearly aren't. Just recently armed Houthis with drone technology that was able to bomb an oil field and cut off 1/5 of the world's oil supply in the blink of an eye. This is the future of war. Saudi needs us. The reform in Saudi Arabia has to happen at a level where it's not top down, though. We have to make sure that they understand that they can preserve their culture and their traditions and that their people can choose. And in fact, Saudis themselves would probably choose the Wahhabist version of Islam for now, but we should still make certain that people that are espousing other alternative views of Islam are not oppressed, because over time ideas change, right? And you see the success of particular systems, and things would work out. So there are things that we can do at concrete policy levels with regard to changing nature, because they need those weapons, and we need them to need those weapons, and we should ally with Saudi Arabia. They have been an ally with us for decades and decades and decades, and they were really what we created, because we armed religious fundamentalism in Saudi Arabia as a way to counter Jamal Abdel Nasser and Nasserism, which was Arab socialism, which was allied in large part with Russia. But that was a consequence of other decisions that we could have preserved liberalism and access to multilateral institutions, because Nasser only turned towards Russia when we didn't authorize the funding of the Aswan Dam project through the World Bank. So all of these things can be understood when we really go into the nuance of the historical trajectory of policy. The Middle East has always been the linchpin of the global order, and we're getting our asses kicked. And we definitely need to take a drastic, immediate turned policy. None of the politicians or the political parties have an agenda to truly address that. There's clearly things that we can do.
I think just like many reformers, you have an enormous task in front of you, and it seems as it's nearly impossible. But I just wanted to say
the human story has been one of perceived catastrophe on the horizon, and then for some reason, the resilience of the human experience always comes true. So right. Now we live in a world where people can hear podcasts like these and all over, right? So we need to continue to espouse these ideas, and there's many people that are espousing things that are similar to them. As long as we preserve the ability of human beings to express themselves and to speak from their heart, I remain optimistic.
Right.
I think we'll be okay.
Have you ever considered, so your current approach, are you working with governments to help with the issues that you just spoke about?
So we want to operate in this space with regard to the domestic scene. Mm-hmm. We're trying to convince the United States government that there's one thing that government needs to do, and that is to provide an alternative to intervention and interdiction, meaning an alternative to the investigation of an FBI officer. If you see someone who's perceived to be radicalized, we need an authorization and funding to conduct precision-guided interventions. But that the government getting involved in the space of prevention and the advocacy of ideas is definitely problematic. Mm-hmm. So we're going to government in one space, intervention and recidivism reduction. But we're going to the philanthropic community, the corporate sector, to try to convince them the imperative nature of doing something to arm grassroots and collective consciousness approaches to waging or combating hate and extremism. The epidemic or the epidemiology of the threat is apparent, but no philanthropist or corporate social responsibility office or high net worth individual has taken it upon themselves. We need to start to see the threat posed by violent extremism in short, in the same way that we see malaria or cancer or other things that we're all too willing to address from a public health perspective. At the international level, the same is true. And there's a way to address this. We need to think holistically. We need to think ecosystemically. One of the organizations that we're hoping to partner with is called Ideas Beyond Border. Faisal Said Mutar, who I'm sure you'll probably have or have had in your ambit. This is an individual whose story is impeccable. He's got a message that is reaching large numbers of people, and he needs to be promoted and to propped up. But the programming and the mechanisms and the design of the initiatives and the programming, that's what we advise on. So myself and partners that think a lot like me, we like to look at how these ideas can be conveyed in ways that are truly effective, and that you can allow a network that you build to become a movement, so to say.
I'm conscious of time, so there are lots of other thoughts, ideas in my head, but thank you so much for giving the time. You've been with us for a little while today. I wish you all the best. Is there places that people who are listening to this podcast can find you and more information about you?
The central hub of our domestic ecosystemic approach to combating hate, extremism, and polarization is housed at lightuponlight.online. That's where we house every component of our program. So you can hit the contact button there and reach out if you want, or you can just view the material that we publicize and the work that we do, which is hosted on that website.
Brilliant.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Yep. Take care.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want more, don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment, because we'd love to hear what you think. Until next time.